The U.S. says the Baghdad bunker raid will not affect the battle plan. Anger in Iraq as the dead are declared martyrs. And Allied troops are reported ready for the ground offensive. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Ratto reporting. Good evening. The start of the Allied ground offensive against Iraqi forces holding Kuwait may be near. Allied airstrikes are being shifted south now, away from Baghdad, to Iraqi troop concentrations in southern Iraq and inside Kuwait. Iraq said today it pulled 288 bodies from the wreckage of a Baghdad bunker the United States bombed yesterday and vowed revenge for civilian deaths. The United States again was emphasizing it has done all it can to prevent civilian deaths, that some civilian casualties are inevitable in war, and especially when Saddam Hussein mixes military targets with civilians. David Martin at the Pentagon begins our coverage.
The U.S. strengthened its insistence today that the bunker was a legitimate military target and that despite the tragic loss of life, there would be no change in American battle plans.
What we can't do is let Iraq stop us from pursuing this war by using civilians as shield.
But even before the building was hit, the U.S. had drastically reduced the number of aircraft targeted against Baghdad, from hundreds a night at the start of the war down to dozens. The only aircraft now flying bombing missions over Baghdad is the stealth fighter, and there are only 40 of those planes flying from Saudi Arabia. Concern over civilian casualties is limiting what the U.S. is going after. Some potential targets, like the Al Rashid Hotel, whose basement is said to contain major communications cables, have been declared off limits for fear of causing civilian casualties.
He has extensive command and control and communication facilities integrated very much within the Baghdad civilian structure.
More and more missions are now being flown against the Iraqi army in and around Kuwait. To shorten the flying time, the Navy has moved another aircraft carrier from the Red Sea into the Persian Gulf, bringing to 4 the number of carriers in the Gulf. 2 of the 1,000 airstrikes flown against the Iraqi army in the last 24 hours dropped 15,000-pound bombs designed to level everything for hundreds of yards around. Most went after Iraqi weapons.
Our primary target right now is located right here, the DC look, and that's going to be artillery.
The U.S. is now claiming to have destroyed 1,300 tanks, 800 armored vehicles, 1,100 artillery pieces. Iraq still has plenty left in the Kuwait theater, but the strength of Saddam Hussein's armored forces is diminishing daily.
So I would say his military position is precarious.
The Allies are clearly preparing the battlefield for a ground offensive. A land war will almost certainly be bloodier than the air war, but at least there will be less chance of accidentally killing civilians. Dan?
Thanks, David. Reports from Baghdad agree that Allied air raids on the capital have tapered off sharply since the attack that destroyed that shelter. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he didn't allow pictures of what he did inside Kuwait, and there were no waves of anger spreading across the Arab world. There are waves of anger spreading among some Arabs now, sparked by the images of death and destruction in Baghdad, which Saddam Hussein has worked to get out to the world. These images are graphic, and some viewers, especially children, may not want to watch our next report. From Amman, Jordan, CBS News correspondent Doug Tennell has that story.
The reason for the gunfire in Baghdad today, not an air raid, but a funeral. 11 who died in the bunker were buried as martyrs, an honor normally reserved for those who fall in battle, their coffins draped with the Iraqi flag. In a nation where morale has been battered by a month of bombing, reporters described an angry new mood today.
This was no government propaganda stunt. The popular mood was unmistakable. It swung from grief to fury and back again. Some men spat in our direction. There's no question that anti-Western feeling has been hardened by this attack.
At the bunker this morning, a crowd of several thousand people shouted, "God is great," each time rescue workers brought out another stretcher. Here, too, there were signs despair had turned to defiance.
We are Iraqi. You know, and tell Bush we are Iraqi. We never afraid from him and from his mom.
There is no final casualty toll yet. Rescue work is still underway. At what was a target for a Western Air Force yesterday, angry survivors targeted Western news teams today.
Children, women, you bastards, bloody bastards!
In neighboring Jordan, the anger turned violent. King Hussein today visited a German student suffering from a stab wound. The student's assailant thought he was an American. At the American embassy, an angry crowd smeared the walls with red paint and mud.
They are not military installations, they are human beings. Children, women, old people.
Unlike the other demonstrations here, this one didn't go away. Protesters tried to launch a make-believe scud into the compound and were still hurling insults well into the night.
Iraq's Minister of Information hurled some harsh insults of his own tonight. He called the Secretary General of the United Nations a criminal conspirator who had remained silent in the face of what the minister called America's crimes. Doug Tennell, CBS News, Amman.
The images of the victims have now been seen around the world. Powerful images that bring home the horror of war, even when people thought they were prepared for it.
Any feeling, compassionate human being would feel this way, enemy or no enemy. It could be you, it could be me, but women and children, I think it's atrocious and tragic.
Which is, some say, just the reaction Saddam Hussein is trying to get from Americans. He had promised a bloody war, and here was the blood, even if it was Iraqi and not American.
It made me sick to see those poor people bombed in that shelter.
I think you'll see more of the unintended loss of Iraqi civilians' lives, unintended on our part, but quite intentional on Saddam Hussein's part.
The arguments may rage over who was responsible, but Saddam Hussein has cast himself as a victim of Western aggression, and the bombing reinforces that image.
Civilian casualties may be something of a windfall for him, and it's not surprising at all to see him taking that opportunity and playing it for all it's worth.
And Saddam is using the Western press to get his message across. Iraqi press accounts might not be believed. The foreign press, some argue, even a heavily censored one, provides some legitimacy.
The reporters on the ground, and more importantly, their networks standing behind them, are a very valuable asset to Saddam.
Those who have been there acknowledge the propaganda value of their work, but say it's important to get some sense of what's going on in the enemy camp.
The reason journalists were being allowed into Iraq at all was that they wanted a message to be relayed to the Western public. And that message was that civilian casualties were being caused because of Allied air attacks.
From the beginning, Saddam's strategy has been more political than military. More than scuds, more than chemical weapons he has not yet used, the civilian casualties have become Saddam's most potent ammunition thus far in the war. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Washington.
President Bush's home front strategy is to fight erosion of public support for the counterattack against Saddam Hussein, to fix the blame for civilian casualties squarely on Saddam. The latest CBS News New York Times poll out tonight indicates President Bush has succeeded so far by keeping U.S. public opinion behind him. The question now is whether support in the UN Security Council is wavering. Bill Plant has more on the war mood.
The UN Security Council began a closed-session debate on the Gulf War. Closed because the U.S. and its allies don't want to advertise division in the world body which authorized the use of force against Iraq.
It's time to have the kind of session in which there can be an interchange of views, not merely an issue of set speech debates.
But Cuba, one of Iraq's two supporters on the Security Council, clearly had a more sharply focused agenda for the talks.
We think that the Council must act immediately to stop the bombing on civilian populations in the area.
A CBS News New York Times poll taken Tuesday and Wednesday shows that the American public does not necessarily agree. 8 out of 10 people don't believe that the U.S.-led coalition is causing excessive damage in Iraq, only what must be expected in wartime. The killing of civilians in a Baghdad bunker broke in the middle of the survey, but the knowledge of those casualties did not alter the overwhelming opinion that U.S. actions were not excessive. While half those polled think that all military targets should be attacked, there are sharp differences between men and women. 2/3 of the men believe military targets should be bombed even when they're in a populated area, but only 1/3 of the women agree. And a large majority of both sexes believes the U.S. should continue bombing rather than begin a ground war anytime soon. Most of those polled don't believe that the U.S. made a mistake in going to war against Iraq. But in what could well be a sign of difficult times ahead, people were about evenly divided over whether a ground war to defeat Iraq would be worth several thousand American lives. Dan?
Bill Plant, thanks. First Lady Barbara Bush went to Indiana today to visit a veterans hospital and air base. The trip to boost military morale began with an unusual move to lower civilian fear of terrorism in the air. The First Lady flew coach on a commercial flight.
Who gave you the idea?
Well, it's my husband and I talked about it. It just seemed like an important thing to do. I mean, I'm not afraid to fly. I'm not going to be held hostage by this at all. I hope the American public won't.
Still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, correspondent Richard Threlkeld on the dramatic impact of Allied airstrikes, and Bob McNamara with a pilot's eye view of the war from the home front. U.S. and Allied aircraft hit Iraqi troops inside Kuwait with hundreds of thunderous airstrikes today. A U.S. commander described the bombardment as, quote, punishment, pure and simple punishment. Iraq shot back with Scud missiles aimed at Saudi Arabia. Richard Threlkeld reports.
It wasn't Israel or the Saudi capital of Riyadh, but the forlorn little Saudi garrison town of Hafr al-Batin that was the target today of the latest Iraqi Scud missiles, two of them that apparently broke apart while in flight. The debris fell in the center of town, demolishing an apartment house. 4 people were slightly injured. It's only a few miles to the Kuwaiti border from the town, and just over the border you can see U.S. Air Force A-10s pounding Iraqi forward positions. Military observers on the scene believe that constant pounding is taking a toll on Iraq's frontline troops.
It's a defeated force. It'll take time for them to fold up their tent and disappear into the desert, but that's exactly what's going to happen.
Incredibly, even after 7 months of Iraqi occupation, there's still an underground resistance in Kuwait City that took these scenes early last month of camouflaged Iraqi armor and sniper positions on rooftops. And the resistance continues. A Kuwaiti drops a Molotov cocktail on a passing truck and flees, while the truck starts burning. If he's caught, the penalty is swift and certain.
There have been more than 200 people executed in Kuwait.
The only help the Kuwaiti resistance has been getting is from the Allied air campaign. And today there was some graphic evidence of how British bombers have been methodically going about destroying some of the 600 concrete shelters for Iraq's remaining warplanes. Allied military officials estimated today that a month of bombing 70,000 missions has now destroyed 1/3 of Iraq's tanks and artillery. That's the good news. The bad news is that Saddam Hussein still has something like 2,000 tanks and 2,000 big guns that remain battle-ready. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News in eastern Saudi Arabia.